To a local issue now in Queensland, which surprisingly the media didn't really mention a week ago when Queensland Parliament, because they know they're running out of time, it's soon that we're all going to the ballot box if you're in Queensland, and it is probably most likely goodbye to a Labor government for the first time in a long time.
Liz, can I pull you up for a second? It's not goodbye, it's bye-bye, Stephen Miles, bye-bye. Anyway, carry on.
They've rammed through this bill called... It always sounds very innocuous. It's called Respect at Work and Other Matters Amendment Bill. Yes, who doesn't want respect at work? We all want respect at work, don't we? Get this. This is One Nation candidate Nick Moir actually explaining what this new bill will mean coming into effect next July.
Well, this is a very dark day in Australia's history, ladies and gentlemen, because this week the Respect at Work and Other Matters Amendment Bill 2024 was passed in Queensland Parliament. Well, what does this mean for you? Well, from now on, we're going to have to police our thoughts and our speech very carefully on social media. And here's why. Any post made on social media now is deemed by this bill to be a public act. And any public act found offensive by a reasonable person of the minority community that it describes is then chargeable under Section 52A of the Criminal Code. And these charges carry a maximum sentence of 3 years jail time. So as you can see, it's not hyperbole to say that this bill paves the way for Queensland citizens to serve jail time for social media posts that offend minorities. This bill is the most egregious encroachment of freedom of speech that I have ever seen in Australia. And worse still, this is a piece of legislation that is self-protecting.
This is social engineering legislation that inevitably absolutely trashes the rights of the individual to simply say what they believe, post what they believe, express their thoughts and feelings without worrying, hey, if this offends someone, I'm in big trouble. Up to 3 years in jail for offending someone. This also ups the ante on employers because the onus is now on them not to punish discrimination if it happens, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. How is this even possible?
There's two major flaws in their thinking, right? The first is they believe that they can somehow eliminate any offence and create a world where no one is ever offended. I preferred it when we believed in religion and we believe that one day in the hereafter God will perfect everything. Once you get rid of religion, then you get governments who believe they can perfect everything now. It's impossible. It's a fantasy to have a world in which no one is ever offended. And the second flaw is that it's desirable that when you get offended, you can run off to the state government and have a bit of a cry and a sook and say, oh, Caleb said something mean to me and I'm offended, and the government are going to go to war on your behalf. That's a ridiculous sort of idea. And the other strange thing about this legislation is it's not just if you offend a person, it's if you offend a group. So I could say something to you that you are not offended by, but somebody else who's part of your identity group, whether they're a female or whether they belong to whatever other group you identify as part of, though you haven't been offended by what I said to you, they could be offended because they identify as part of your group, which is a ridiculous breach of common sense, not to mention civil liberties.
And it's the pernicious nature in which they introduce this kind of legislation. So it's buried in, as you said before, the whatever it's called, you know...
Respect at work
and other matters. And other matters.
This is the other matter we're talking about here.
No free speech. That's the other matter.
They're the most onerous workplace discrimination laws in the country. They go further than any piece of federal legislation. They go further than any other state's legislation in putting the onus on the workplace to stop discrimination before it happens. OK, so what, you know, the coppers now, I'm just, you know, broadening this out from the workplace, but are we now expecting the coppers to go and knock on everyone's door? Excuse me, sir, are you likely to commit a crime today? I just want to check in before I have to come and arrest you later. I just want to know now. I mean, how is an employer meant to know whether a member of staff is going to do something that may or may not be discriminatory. But they hide stuff like this in legislation like that so that you don't notice that it's going on, which is why we're talking about it 6 days. This was passed on the 10th of September. We're talking about it now 6 days after the fact because we hadn't heard that this was happening. I mean, you know, we're doing a national news program here, so we can't be across absolutely everything. But you would have expected that the media in Queensland would have been right on top of something like this. But no, it took us nearly a week to hear that this had happened, and that's why we're talking about it tonight. And it was only last week that the federal government not only introduced its own misinformation, disinformation laws, it introduced watered-down hate speech laws. Now, originally, that was going to be that if you offended someone or committed hate speech, quote-unquote, on the basis of not just race but religion, sexuality, disability,
gender
a whole cast of things, that you would have been up before the court. We just dodged that bullet, and I wrote in the Advertiser last week, thank God we dodged that bullet, but this is not going to be the end of it. Well, I needn't have worried about having to wait a few months for this to come up again. It was literally happening last week. If the federal government can't do it, the states are going to do it. This is why the culture wars matter, because they ain't going to stop until they have banned anyone from saying anything. It's about redefining truth, ultimately.
And the creepy way in which they do this, as if Queenslanders would have thrown their weight behind this, as if Queenslanders would have voted for this. But no, sneak it in, no media coverage, nobody even knows it's happened. They'll just be hit with it come July next year when these laws come into effect. It was Noam Chomsky who once said, and I know that he's a massive lefty, but he had some brilliant things to say. He was saying that the best way to keep people passive, to keep them silent, is to severely restrict the spectrum of acceptable opinion. But very smartly, you allow robust debate within that spectrum, thereby giving people like us the impression that there's free thinking happening, there's debate happening. No, the spectrum is very much restricted. So people think, oh, we have freedom of speech here, there's debate happening. This isn't China, this isn't Russia. But I would argue that the propaganda that goes on, the restriction on free speech in Western countries is almost worse because we do have this idea that, no, it's not happening here. That's something that happens under dictatorships. But really, that debate that you're watching is simply reinforcing the presuppositions of the system one way or another, but it's all pointing in the same direction. Who among us in our daily lives isn't already self-censoring? You would catch yourself doing it all the time if you're paying attention to the wheels of your mind every time you're like, oh, can't say that, oh, I hope nobody overheard that conversation that I'm just having with a friend at a cafe because that was socially unacceptable. It's just unbelievable how this has crept in year after year and now bill after bill right under people's noses without them even knowing.
And when you say it's crept in year after year, I remember back in 2004, so this is 20 years ago, there was a Sri Lankan-born preacher in Melbourne, Danny Naylor, who was doing a seminar for Christians in his church, and he was comparing Christianity with Islam, and he read from the Quran. He just read it, and people started laughing because the part he read, obviously they thought it sounded ridiculous. And he was hauled before a anti-discrimination tribunal for ridiculing Islam. And all he did was he didn't tell a joke. He wasn't putting on funny voices. He simply read from the Quran. And the commissioner actually asked him, did you intend for people to laugh or did you know that people were going to laugh? And he said, how can I be responsible for the responses of other people when I simply read from a religious text? Now, that was 20 years ago. It was ridiculous then. It's still ridiculous today. And yet the government continue to push these things. I imagine, however, Anthony Albanese might like these laws because he'll go and complain that he's being bullied